Hey everyone! So I wanted to do a quick review on this, Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is going to be more of a casual kind of review. I'm not really going to go too in depth in the story. I'm not going to cover any spoilers or anything like that, so don't worry about that. I mainly wanted this video to be more of a conversation, or at least like a one-way conversation, where I just give my opinion on this book and what I thought of it. Now, originally, I wasn't planning on reading this book, but I ended up watching the first couple episodes of the show that's based off of this book, House of Dragon, and I was actually surprised how much I was enjoying the show. So I stopped after the first 3 episodes because I was like, hey, I want to read the book first, since the book is always, or at least 99% of the time, better than an adaptation is. Well, in the case with this book, I would actually probably say the adaptation is better than the source material itself. This is definitely not a bad book in my opinion, but if you compare it to George R.R. Martin's other books, especially his Song of Ice and Fire series, it's definitely not nearly on the level of those books. Instead of holding this the whole time, let me just kind of put it up there like that. Is that okay? Let me see if I can prop it up with maybe something like this. Yeah, that's better, I guess. That way I don't need to hold it. Now, I haven't read any of George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire books in probably close to 10 years now, or at least since the last book came out, A Dance with Dragons. Alright, so look at this. I was actually checking the copyright information of A Dance with Dragons. This is the last A Song in Ice and Fire book that George R.R. Martin has written. And it looks like this book has a copyright of, right there, 2011. Now, I don't think I read this book right when it came out, but the fact that it's been over 10 years since the last book in this series was released, I mean, wow. Time really flies, I guess. So I've really fallen out of interest in that world. Not because I didn't enjoy it, not at all. Actually, on the contrary, I absolutely loved that series back when I read it. But since it's been so long, I've forgotten a lot of the events and the characters and what's really happening in that universe. I also never watched the Game of Thrones show beyond the first 2 seasons. I do know that it ended absolutely spectacularly and that the last season was in no way disappointing though, so that's good to hear. But that's the good thing about this book. You actually don't need to be familiar with Game of Thrones, the show, or A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series, to be able to enjoy this. That being said, you probably will get a little bit more enjoyment out of it, and definitely if you are a fan of that world that George R.R. Martin created, you'll definitely get more enjoyment out of this book than you would otherwise. And like I said at the beginning of this video, the book I found to be all right. Definitely not a great book, but not a bad book either. And honestly, I think that has more to do with how the book is written than the actual contents of the book itself. The story takes place hundreds of years before A Song of Ice and Fire, and is told from a maester's point of view, giving a recount of the history of the Targaryen Empire. This means you're not inside any of the characters' heads, so you really don't get their point of view as events unfold in the story. So definitely don't go into this book thinking it's completely normal or written like a completely normal book. It is definitely written in a more unique way. In a way, it's kind of similar to what Tolkien did with his Silmarillion book. It's just not nearly as vast or nearly as dense as what Tolkien did. Also, don't be intimidated by this book at all. Unlike the Silmarillion, this is a fairly easy read, and you can get pretty much all the details in this book in a single read. It's not like it takes multiple readings like the Silmarillion to really grasp all of the details. One of the things I really do like about this style of writing, though, is that you almost need to take a grain of salt with what the maesters or the people narrating the book are saying. Because they might not be recounting the histories exactly as they unfolded, or they might have their own biases that they're adding into the story. From that aspect, I actually thought it was a pretty interesting read. However, what this also means about this writing style is that at times it can come off as a little dry and sterile.
After all, I mean, it is a historical recount of the Targaryen Empire, so it's not exactly a story following sets of characters and the different adventures and different things that happen to them, although you do still kind of get that with the historical retelling. And I know that's what a lot of other reviewers have said about this book, that it can be tedious and kind of dry at points. But honestly, I didn't think it was all too bad. Especially going into this book, I already knew the structure and the way the book was written, so it didn't bother me really. I mean, it's not like you're reading a straight up history textbook, it's nothing like that. And also, I mean, to be perfectly honest, the history of the Targaryen Empire is pretty fascinating. So, it definitely kept my interest throughout reading it. But like I said, as long as you know going into reading this book that it's written in this style, I don't think it's really going to bother you. That being said, if you are looking for an in depth story with intense characters and subplots and all this stuff going on, you're really not going to get that in this book. Not to say that there aren't some suspenseful aspects to the story, but it's definitely less suspenseful because it's not like you're actually living in that moment. Without getting into any spoilers, I will say that the best part of this book, in my opinion, was the events that covered what the show is building up to. I thought that part of the book was absolutely fascinating, but I'm not going to get into any spoilers, so don't worry about that. If you are a big fan of George R. R. Martin and have read his A Song of Ice and Fire series, then a lot of the things that take place in this book, you're already going to be kind of aware of, at least slightly aware of some of the big events that take place in this book. Of course, in this story, you get way more details and it goes way more in depth, so it really helps flesh out the history of what happened in the Targaryen Empire prior to the events that take place in A Song of Ice and Fire series. One of the things I love most about Martin's other books, especially Song of Ice and Fire, is the characters he creates in those books. The fact that they're multi-layered and complex, it's truly fascinating. Unfortunately, with this book, you really don't get any of that, which is a shame because that is, or at least has been, the highlight for me when I read Martin's other books. Another thing about this book, and this might be a little random, I mean, it probably is, but I found this book to be really, really good if you want to practice speed reading. I know, it's kind of random, right? And the reason I think this book is perfect for practicing speed reading is because every single chapter, or pretty much every single chapter, starts off with a quick recap of what happened in the prior chapter. So if you're speed reading the chapter, and you miss some of the details, I mean, okay, that might hurt your enjoyment of the story, maybe a little bit. Probably not too much, honestly, because a lot of these details are unnecessary to understand what's really happening in the story. But even if you miss some of those details, you do get a quick recap in the following chapter. That way, you can see if you missed any important details while you were speed reading the prior chapter. I just think it's kind of a really good book to practice speed reading. So I do want to kind of cover a little bit of the story, really not going in depth at all, just a quick overview to talk about what the story's about and what it covers. The book starts off with the Targaryens gaining control of the crown and then how they bring the Seven Kingdoms together. It then follows generations of Targaryens as they rule over the Seven Kingdoms, and the different ways that they do rule, and the different things that they accomplish, or maybe don't accomplish, while they are in power. I really like how some of the Targaryens were honestly pretty great rulers, and then some of the Targaryens were pretty bad rulers. And it's really fascinating to see how the preceding generation of Targaryen rulership really overwrites what the prior generation did, or, maybe fixes it, or maybe kind of ruins some things that were already working. It's pretty fascinating. And, just like in real life history, you have periods of prosperity and peace, followed by periods of hardship and war. So, it's pretty accurate from that standpoint. But then you get to the end of the book, and this is kind of one of my bigger issues with this book, because going into this, I thought this was going to be starting with how the Targaryens get the crown all the way until how they lose the crown, which then a Game of Thrones picks up, and then that story follows. Unfortunately, you don't get that in this book. This essentially just covers the first half of the Targaryen Empire and doesn't cover the second half at all. And this, honestly, I must say, was disappointing because, I mean, now, okay, we need to address the elephant in the room, okay? So, is there going to be a second book? Well, according to what George R. R. Martin has said, yes, he plans on writing a sequel to this book. However, as we all know, Martin has a lot of things he's working on. He's doing television shows, he's trying to finish A Song of Ice and Fire, he wants to do more Dunk and Egg books, which I feel like I'm the only one in the world that actually cares about that. I really want him to continue that series because I really enjoyed it so far and would like to see more. But anyways, so he has all of those things he has to work on top of writing a sequel to this. And I mean, without being crude or anything, you know, he's not getting any younger. So that's potentially gonna become an issue. Okay, and then that leads us to another point. This book was kind of unnecessary, and I know that's what a lot of people say. I think that to an extent, definitely not to the extent of what other people say, where they're like, oh, it's completely unnecessary. It's still a fascinating book, and if you are a fan of this world that Martin has created, it's definitely fascinating from that standpoint. However, a tiny bit of me can understand how and why people think that this book is unnecessary. After all, a lot of the big events that take place in this book, we already kind of know from his Song of Ice and Fire series, just not nearly in depth as what you get in this book. And since he wrote this book in the last couple years, that means it did take away time from when he could have been working on Winds of Winter, which I know is the big issue. But that's the thing, okay? Martin can do whatever the heck he wants. It's his life, it's his story, it's his world he created. Whatever he wants to focus on, he can do it. That's his prerogative, that's his call, and I understand that. However, of course, as a fan, what I would love to see is I would love to see him actually finish his original series that started this whole world. And if you're going into this book with that mindset, you're really just going to waste your time because you're not going to enjoy this book because you're just going to be thinking the whole time, why'd he waste his time writing this book when he could have been writing Winds of Winter? So if you have that mindset, don't even worry about reading this book because you're not going to enjoy it because you already have that opinion in your mind. But hey, I mean, honestly, maybe we should just be happy that Martin created this world to begin with. And the fact that now he's really fleshed out the history. I mean, he really goes in depth in this book. And, you know, as a fan of this world, that's a good thing. It's definitely not a bad thing. So, and I guess I'm happy from that aspect. So yeah, sorry, that's just my rant. I just wanted to get that out of the way since that is the elephant in the room. But, you know, if we're talking about this book, then it's kind of something we need to discuss, at least a little bit. So, to wrap up, is this a great book? No. Is it a good book? Yeah, I mean, okay, I can see that. Is it a fine book? Yes, definitely, it's totally a fine book. Is it a bad book? No. No, it's not a bad book, not in the slightest. It might be different from Martin's other books, you know, just in the way the book is written, but that makes it kind of unique. And as long as you go into this book knowing that it is a historical retelling of the Targaryen Empire, and it's not told in a traditional kind of way, I don't really think it's going to bother you. It didn't really bother me, but I knew that going in. So, you know, if you don't know that going in, you might be kind of thrown for a loop and you might be, ooh, I don't like this. So, you know, just keep that in mind. If you are a fan of Martin and are a big fan of his Song of Ice and Fire series, then I would say absolutely read this book because you're going to get way more details of that world and way more history, and it's really great from that aspect. If you're like me and you were a big fan of that world but kind of fell out of it because it's taken Martin so long to really write the next book in the series, I would say sure, maybe try giving this book a read. You might enjoy it. You might not. But if you were a fan, then I think you probably would enjoy this. Now, if you're not a fan of Martin's, or if you haven't read any of his books, I definitely wouldn't recommend you start off with this book. Definitely start off with reading A Game of Thrones before reading this. That way you can see if you like this world, and if you like Martin's writing style. Of course, this book is in a different writing style, but at least you'd be able to tell if you're interested in this world, and if you want to get far more details, which you do get from this book. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Fire and Blood. If you have any comments or questions down below, or if you have any different opinions about this book, like if you really enjoyed it and thought it was fantastic, or if you absolutely hated it and thought it was terrible, comment down below. I really like getting different takes on books. It's really fascinating. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Okay. Action. Action.
Action. It's 5 a.m. I'm tired, not sleeping. Babies don't let you sleep. They don't. I don't look too tired, do I? Whatever. I look fine. This is just going to be a casual review. Casual review of this book. Not going too in depth. Nope. No spoilers. Just a light video review of my opinions of this book. All right, let's do it.